Welcome back to our debate about NATO, EU, and Euro enlargement, and especially now about the area which some call the ex-Yugoslavian area. I don't like all this ex-Soviets, ex-Yugoslavia, but nevertheless, the idea is we talk now about these seven successor states of an ex-Yugoslavia and how they should join NATO and EU and the Euro and what can be done about it. And I will go into very strong details about Yugo nostalgia, because that's the debate which is still there, that there was something good in Yugoslavia, that there were some aspects which were good, and that's a little bit of a mystification of Yugoslavia. And I will try now in this presentation to counter this fake narrative that Yugoslavia was something good, yeah? Because it wasn't. It was a brutal terror regime, and it was maybe not as terrible as Albania or Bulgaria or the Soviet Union, but it was in its essence a socialist dictatorship, with a brutal military and secret service, and it has not shied away from a lot of brutality. And I will discuss some of these aspects, and I will outline why the necessity is very clear for fast-track Euroization of all of ex-Yugoslavia, all countries, and also to make sure that the future is basically similar or the same, like Slovenia is already in the Euro, in the EU, in NATO, and that's the way to go for all seven of the successor states of Yugoslavia. So that's basically the story about this presentation. And I have made it very clear, joining fast the single market, here the logos of NATO and the European Union, and here this symbolization of the seven successor states from Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia, Serbia, Montenegro, Kosovo, and Macedonia. And how to make peace, I will also conclude in this presentation. Let me come back to the 1st of December 1918, and that should be the EU Day against the myth of Yugo nostalgia, because it's there. Some people really, especially in Western left-wing circles, but also some people who have a passion for the Balkans, yeah, they hear a lot about Yugoslavia. Some of them have never been there because it's now already 30 years gone. And the idea is always, okay, before Milosevic it was working and it was so good. And Tito, they have heard about it, they read some of them, of the stuff. And then it's a certain mystification in its anti-Americanism and, the third way and the non-aligned movement. And all these things are somehow there. And I will step by step now try to debunk all these myths which are there, especially about the economic success of Yugoslavia, about the idea that everybody had a flat, everybody had a car, everybody had a job. And I will explain a little bit how basically this all came about, how this myth developed. And that the reality was that there was the secret service, which was brutal enough, killing people even in Western Europe. There was, of course, a mass immigration because people had voted with their feet because it was not working. And there was massive debt levels all the time. And it was very dramatic. And it was from no single moment really a good, decent state in our European understanding of a decent rule of law or any kind of rights or civil liberties. It was from the beginning a very brutal dictatorship. And while it has maybe softened at various periods, it was never something which we should be somehow nostalgic about it. Yeah, and that is definitely totally wrong perception, and we have to debunk it. We have to start with the fundament why it was created. It was created and it has led to the internal fragility of Yugoslavia from the very start on the 1st of December 1918. The idea that the two parts, basically Serbia and the freshly occupied territories of Kosovo and Macedonia, I will come in the next slide to the southern additions to Yugoslavia. But basically, when you see about 60% of the territory, which then became on the 1st of December 1918 Yugoslavia, that was basically territory which was for before part of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. And why all these states have chosen to be united under the kingdom of Serbia, Croatia, and Yugoslavia. I have here the Isonzo front, and that's very important to understand. Basically, It was the Southern Slav regiments and the army of the Austrian-Hungarian monarchy, which was defending against the Italians here at the Isonzo. And once the Austrian army disintegrated, basically when the Austrian monarchy disintegrated, the Italian army could have easily taken significant parts of Slovenia, significant parts of today's Croatia, and basically there was nobody to stop them because there was no military force available anymore in the Austrian-Hungarian monarchy, and the only army left was the Serbian army, which obviously had also a good standing as an allied army, and so the idea was basically to stop the Italians. It was never the idea, basically, to have a great union of Yugoslavia and be happily living under the Serb monarchy. That was certainly not the idea of the Slovenes and the Croatians and the Bosnians. Some maybe, in an open society, there's always various aspects and various ideas. But the overwhelming majority of the people, they simply didn't want to live under Italian king, and they decided for the Serb king. That was the two alternatives which were there left in for them, and so this was created under duress and the lack of other options, but not on love or feeling of unity. And from the beginning, basically, the territories were simply added to the Serbian kingdom under the Serbian king, under Serbian control. And so basically that was the start, and it only lasted for 10 years until everything turned out into a dictatorship in the year 29. So basically already with the shooting on the 20th of June 1928 in the parliament, and that was basically the end of this 10 years of effort to try to balance what really didn't belong together and what really didn't want to be together, and it ended in a dictatorship after 10 years. And the similar can be said about the southern territories, because on the 18th of October 1913, the Austrian monarchy has basically put an ultimatum to the Serbian forces to leave at least Albania. And that's what they did, and 5 days or 8 days later, by end of October 1913, and they stayed in Kosovo and in Macedonia, the territories that are today a Republic of Kosovo and Republic of North Macedonia. But basically they have liberated, occupied, it's always a question of perspective, exactly at this moment in 2012, 2013. So we cannot really say that was long-term Yugoslav unity then in 1918, but basically what happened is that these territories were also under military occupation. There was a genocide committed against the Albanians in 1912, 1913, and a long time afterwards as well. And basically that's the story about Yugoslavia. When you look at it, in this northern and western parts really didn't want to be there, and the southern parts, like today's Kosovo and Macedonia, also didn't want to be there. So basically, that was the internal fragility of Yugoslavia from the very start, yeah, from the year 1918 onwards, and so it continued. I won't focus in this presentation. I've made another one about the interwar years and the Second World War, but I will now go basically to the year when there came this famous Stalin-Tito split on the 28th of June 1948. It's always a very important day on the 28th of June when there was expelled from the Communist International. The Yugoslavia was expelled from the Second Communist International. And of course, you know why it came, because Tito really didn't want to obey orders. There were different ideas about the Greek Civil War, about the whole order on the Balkans, about ideology. And obviously, you know, there was also this lack of there was the crisis in Germany, the Berlin conflict, and Tito was not loyal enough, and so he was kicked out. And he understood at that moment as well, in this escalation of the Cold War, that there is an alternative, and he can play what he already learned in World War II, basically play off the two big powers and trying to get the maximum out of the very important strategic position of Yugoslavia. And basically that is what happened. Yeah? Because from that moment onward, from 48 until it was officialized in 51, basically very much the Yugoslavia became a communist or socialist client state of the USA actually. But not to say that it was a democracy, not to say that it was capitalist or something. No, no, no. That it was totally different. It was a geostrategic balancing client state of the USA, but it was following very much socialist ideas. Yeah. For example, at this year's, it has changed later, but collectivization of farmland was a very big thing after the Second World War. And here, the most famous, the Chassin Farmer Rebellion in 1950, on the 6th of May, on George of Dan, it was a big uprising of the Bosnian farmers against the fact that they were taking the land. They were used to fight in World War II. They took up arms again, and 17 of them were executed. Executed, yeah, like really capital punishment, yeah, for the rebellion. So there's so much about Yugo nostalgia, really quite shocking facts on the ground. Yeah? So let's come to the year 51 when the American administration under Eisenhower, he had basically and then officialized the support for Tito. What happened? Because the Cold War was escalating. We are now talking about the period there was already the Korea War going on, and we had the Berlin crisis over Berlin crisis, and this was really the most terrible period of the Korea War. And so obviously the idea was, can we hurt the Soviets? Can we keep the Yugoslavia out of the Soviet bloc? And you see here the Cold War, how the border really happened, the Iron Curtain. Yugoslavia was not in that Iron Curtain. Yeah? It was a socialist client state of the West. Yeah? Very much peculiarity, if you want. Yeah? I wouldn't also totally agree with this. It was a land, like Austria was a bit of a northern Yugoslavia. It was a bit of a mix. We were much freer. We were, of course, a freer country. But we were also not joining NATO, like the BRD, but we were somehow in between, and the Yugoslavians were also somehow in between, and it's one of these complicated Cold War compromises. Yeah, like Mr. Borrell in Munich this year, he made this famous statement about the US being pro-Franco. Certainly, they were not pro-Franco, but Tito was the leader of the president of Yugoslavia. Franco was the leader of Spain. They were both World War II personalities who kept on in their states, and they were both non-Soviets. And so, in various aspects, they got at least some support because it was better than being in the communist camp. I will have reminded everybody, please. That was the moment, not just the Korea War, this really terrible escalation, but also when China was lost. So losing another important country in the south of the Mediterranean, also in the south of Europe at the Mediterranean, like Spain or Yugoslavia, that was certainly not on the agenda for the Americans at that moment. And so they started to financially subsidize Yugoslavia of Tito. And the long story of debt addiction started. And so basically much of this famous prosperity of Yugoslavia was built on exactly that debt which started to flow in the year 51. Then comes the 1st of September, the foundation of 1961 of the non-aligned movement. And this is very important to understand. All these left-wing commentators from Europe who are somehow positive about Yugoslavia, because that phase of decolonialization, Tito with Gandhi, Tito with all these famous leaders of the newly established free world, and who all wanted to be a different way. They were socialist in their economics, but they didn't want to be Soviet client states. They didn't want to be American client state. And then, all these spectacular meetings, driving in the open cars through Belgrade, that was, of course, here the myth of the success of Yugoslavia really very much is symbolized by being the leader of the third world, the social alternative, the different. It was not a negative word. The third world was very much seen as a third way between the capitalism and the communism. And so, while it was all socialist economics, yeah, and this kind of philosophy has a certain attraction for some segments in the West today. And it has led to this myth of Yugoslavia somehow working and, being better than the West with all its colonial inheritance, and also, of course, different than the Soviet Union, and obviously all funded by US taxpayers and gradually by Western European taxpayers when we got richer as well. So obviously, it was then already in this kind of grandstanding that the constitution was changed again. A lot of changes in the Yugoslavian constitution because it was never very cohesive, the state, with all its differences, ethnicity, religion, and direction and personalities. But then Tito, on the 7th of April 63, he has appointed himself, because it was not a democracy, not forget, he has created their own institution, he has created their own constitution, and he appointed himself for life. Yeah? So much for democracy in a lifetime presidency and Yugo nostalgia. And for him, it was already, quite good, because he was in a way important, yeah. Yugoslavia, and that is still what is somehow lingering in the myth of Yugo nostalgia, to be received by Khrushchev, by Kennedy, by the Queen, and all this myth of the Second World War, and so ultimately, that was really a personality bigger than the country, yeah? And so basically the country had about 20 million people, 21, then the GDP was 20 billion. So basically it had 10% of the population of the USA in that years, and it has 1.3 of the GDP of the USA about, yeah. But it was at this crucial Adriatic Cold War front, yeah, and that's why it was so important. And that's why the US credit was flooding in, while it was never really very stable, because all this global ambition, all these internal renovations, they needed to be funded and paid for. And from the beginning, there was no real money, because it is a rather poor area in southeastern Europe. It always historically has been. And it's very mountainous, very beautiful, very amazing, but it's not a very rich area. And then they basically printed money, and the US paid. And it started then the big economic reform, which was called the hard dinar. That was the dinar is the currency of Yugoslavia. And they had a lot of myths because of their own propaganda. They called it the hard dinar, the hard currency. But it was always printed as much as they could. And they started the hard dinar with a major devaluation. And that was just the first of a big round of devaluations to follow. And basically, there was no money for all these wishes. And it was always this big personality who wanted to have all his campaigns and, all the pleasures, all this global network and everything. But there was no money for it. So what to do? They printed money, and they printed on and on. I have made several slides on the debt, because there's beautiful statistics out there about how big the debt was in 54 with 400 million, and in 87 it was already 20 billion, of course in the money of the time. Then the various conversion rates in the various times, and the currency reforms, it ended up in the billions ultimately. But already in 60, it was the first currency reform, and they started exactly there, because they were running out of money, and they were having a lot of debt, and the economy was not picking up because of this socialist third way. So look here, the comparison between Austria and Yugoslavia. Quite comparable economies, very close, have been in one economic area until 1918. But the Austria followed the Western economic model more or less. Yeah, was also with state-owned companies, very very soft form of market economy in a sense on this front end of the Cold War. But already the development differential was huge. And here on the right, you see the debt spiral. Fooch, it was going upwards because the ambition was so big. Inflation, that means money printing, and there was a limit of economic growth that was not very strong, and so not so much things to export. And the thing was, for the hard dinner was a complete illusion from 61 onwards, from the first devaluation, and then came the next devaluation. That was the first one. That was then the second one. Yeah, exactly. And then came, the ultimate. I have this slide. It's also a beautiful one. When you see then after the hyperinflation, which was then the period in the 80s and 90s, yeah, especially in the 90s during the embargo and the wars. And then it was now then in the first of January in 2000 in 94, they had the idea to peg the dinner to 1 German mark. Because and that was in 94. That was similar like the Bosnian mark. It was also created by Dayton, and then it was pegged for sure, and it stayed pegged until this very day. The Bosnian mark is pegged to the German mark, but now to the euro, obviously. And you see, and that is the situation when it was pegged to now 1 Bosnian mark, which was 1 dinar in 94 in a sense. Then it's now 60 Serbian dinars for one. So you see, even then in the last period after the wars from 94, then there was, of course, the Kosovo War and another sanction and a lot of crises. So constantly there was basically devaluation from the start to the end. Yeah, it started in 65. And down it went, and always it was meant to be supported by US or Western European credits, and they continued to pay, because the logic was always the same. Let's keep Yugoslavia in our camp because of the Cold War. And so without any kind of limits, there was this kind of credit policy from the Western world in order to keep Yugoslavia out of the Soviet camp. Than ever in the 60s, there was already much closer reintegration in the Comecon and politics, because the Soviet Union looked quite successful, and especially in the 70s there was a lot of going to the east from their side. Yeah. So what they did, because when you don't have a lot of things to sell in economics as a country, what do you do? And basically, ultimately, they had this idea, because some of the Slovenes and Croatians were already leaving to Austria. They saw there might be a lot of interest in these booming Western European economies, which in 20 years after the war were already quite successful, because they had the currency reform and the mark was working and the shilling was pegged to the mark. And then what happened is that they had this idea, oh, we can send more people outside. And so this very big state-organized form of worker contracts with Germany and Austria, but also with other Western European countries, started, where basically the idea was, okay, they need people over there, we will send them. So it was quotas, there was real competition to get them. Yeah? And there was a real kind of a big, massive state-organized transfer of workers who had also a special status, like being employed, but outside. Yeah? And this was all their kind of economic development concept, sent the people outside. They sent over 1,100,000 people outside. It's quite a lot. Yeah? I mean, when you see of the percentage of the employed people, it was over 20.5% of the officially employed people in Yugoslavia in these years were workers abroad. And some of the less economically successful, because of geographic and historic reason, like Bosnia, it was 30%. Macedonia, 30%. Yeah? This is Kosovo, 30%. 30% of the employed people, of all of the people in the republic who had employments, were not there. They were outside and sending money back. That was basically the development concept of a very cash-strapped economy, which had to find some way to finance the big ambition it had. And so it started all these Gastarbeiter routes through Yugoslavia, going to Austria, Germany, and the Benelux country, to England. And, there was a massive human drain. Because of this failed economic system, which was from the start not working. Yeah? And so it happened. Yeah? great people, don't get me wrong, but Yugoslavia was also very beautiful, but it never worked economically from the day one, and everybody knew it. And obviously, the Croatians, which were, of course, they had the history of being part of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. They had also this terrible history of World War II collaboration and the Ustaša. And, then was always the argument. But my point is, in November 71, there was again, because what you do when you don't really control inflation because you print a lot of money, then authoritarian states always try to freeze the prices. Yeah? Then they started a price freeze, and then came this protest of the Yugoslavian intelligence. Obviously, you can always say the Croatians are fascists, and some of them were, obviously, yeah. But you can always say these were people like they were intellectuals of Yugoslavia. These were people in the institutions in Croatia. They made this protest because the thing was when you freeze the prices, the products disappear. And it was total failed economics. And you didn't have to be a big superstar in the academia and as a student to understand that this system is not really producing any form of prosperity and of decent living standards. And so what happened, obviously, there came the spring, then the pressure of the Soviets, the invitation to Tito, and of course, what the socialist state always does, purges and trying to crack down against any kind of internal opposition, because Tito preferred really to sit with the Queen instead of being then serious reforming his country. Obviously, all funded with US taxpayers' money because of, in the 1970s, clearly it was the height of the Cold War. It was very difficult. And after a purge, obviously, it was a bit more open in a sense. They understood they have to do something. And then they built up this new constitution as a kind of compromise to the Croatians in order to somehow appease at least some of the elites and in order to find some way forward. Yeah. And obviously, then the Soviet Union was a bit stronger. They had money from selling gas to Western European consumers. The US was a bit weaker with Nixon resigning, the Vietnam War. So it was all, and then came the oil shock, obviously. That was really another bitter blow for Yugoslavia, who is an oil net importer. And so they needed more funding. They tried to apply for anybody. It was a desperate situation. So they did some kind of compromise, internal kind of constitution. And there's a lot of myth over it. It could have worked, there could have been a way for Yugoslavia to survive. But, everything was paid already with massive increases of debts, yeah. And that moment, and here this statistic is very important, the debt in 47, obviously because of the oil price, because that was the biggest import item, it exploded. Yeah? The trade deficit and the external debt exploded. So while trying, to keep a beautiful picture outside and inside, making compromises, somehow paced over the crisis with Croatia from 71, by doing a new constitution, the money was was completely gone already, and it escalated with the second oil shock. And then obviously you had another Kosovo Spring, and that was in 81 when the students there, because the living conditions were very terrible. Always again here, and there's a lot of reports how terrible the living conditions already were there because there was no money. There was basically a total economic crisis already, and debts were piling up. And then obviously they say it always Kosovo protest, and Serb propaganda has then called the 81 already as a kind of the greater Albanian uprising, exactly like they always use this argument. Every Croatian university professor is from the Ustaša. Certainly they wouldn't have been in Yugoslavia university professors if they had any link to this terrible terror regime of the 40s. Yeah? But you can always discredit then the discontent, the social discontent of in principle loyal groups, yeah, and for when they make protests, and obviously then they crack down very hard, and obviously this created more resentments. And anyhow, the Yugoslavians, in Yugoslavia, the Albanians were never very well represented because already then they were 8% of the population. but they were not really in any meaningful way represented decently in whatever. It was anyhow a socialist dictatorship. So what kind of democratic representation you can think of? So anyhow, there was already this second part of social and economic unrest after the Croatian and then the Kosovo Spring, and then came obviously a big country needs Olympic Games. Yeah, whenever you are now at the depth curve, you're like a fever curve. Yeah, in 80, which is up there, up there, and then you need to organize Olympic Games. There's a big myth, that the people themselves they did a lot of in-kind contribution. Yeah, exactly, because nobody could pay for anything anymore. And it has reached such levels that the US, which was funding Yugoslavia all the time, now under different regime, was already making a national security directive under President Reagan now in the first term, saying, it's very worrying this amount of debt because a client state totally dependent on US funding on doing Olympic Games, and that was really very, very problematic. And so the thing was already reaching that kind of level. But the show must go on, obviously. But yes, then came obviously the whole point of the second part of the Reagan mandate, because we have to see it in the geostrategic situation, because the whole business case of Yugoslavia was a kind of a geostrategic blackmail. Yeah? We don't have money. We are an important country in a sense regionally here in the Cold War border. We auction ourselves off to the superpowers. Yeah? But the whole case didn't break because of Tito's death. Yeah? It broke because there was suddenly a detente and Gorbachev's perestroika and glasnost. There was this kind of end phase of the Cold War with all these Reykjavik and other Malta summits. And there was all this kind of detente, which has led then also to the breakup of the Soviet Union and also to the end of the Cold War. But in these years, obviously, the case for Yugoslavia to be paid by the US taxpayers for no reforms and for this grandstanding globally was no longer really working. And also the personality of Tito was gone with its post-war glory and with its war glory as well. And then the whole Ponzi scheme, Yugoslavia, it broke. And it broke wild. Yeah? And obviously, there was no money for import anymore, and then, when then the inflation roared, and then what you have ultimately is everybody looking for, there you have this kind of financial scandals, which are quite automatically, once you are in a devaluation and high inflation currency and, debt is somehow just, less worth after 3 months, then you get all this financial wizardry or manipulation or Ponzi schemes, which then lead to more corruption, more problems. There was this, but basically that's one economic effect. But what is happening, obviously, then different people, like I have here the 3 most prominent, Stambolic, Milosevic, and Ante Markovic, and they have different visions, of a Western Yugoslavia trying to reform, of a kind of a reformed Yugoslavia, or to somehow see there is no future anymore for unity, and to go for a more radical nationalist agenda and to save, at least the elite system and the core of the empire, basically to save Serbia and ex-Yugoslavia in the form of Serbia. And they were competing very brutally with different visions in a very fragile economy, and so everything exploded in a war, and there was nothing to be saved anymore. It was already doomed long ago, but with the Cold War coming to an end, basically it all exploded wildly because of the internal fragilities and the debt Ponzi scheme on which it was built. I want to also reiterate that the problem was that from the start they didn't use all this funding from the US wisely, because it was a socialist economy and because of all these internal fragilities. They tried to pay off various regions and groups, ethnic groups, with some kind of fantasy investment. 24 February was the start of the Trepča mining, And this was really about regional autonomy, they say, but it was very much about working conditions, about getting investments. This was really very poor people already working under very dangerous conditions in a very badly developed mine. And this is all over Yugoslavia. You can see aluminium plants in countries where they don't have real energy for the households. Yeah? Where you can see ruins of industrial wasteland everywhere. And now gradually only in the countries where the European Union, Slovenia and Croatia, it's getting much better obviously now by time. And there was really such a misallocation of capital in wasteful, damaging, industrial kind of fantasy project all over. They were never, many of them, they were technically maybe interesting. Yeah? In theory, you could make money with capture, but in reality, it was a loss generator, a waste of life, and risk for the human beings, for the environment, which the European taxpayers for decades will have to pay and will have to recover on. It is a huge environmental and industrial and economic crime, this badly managed industrialization, and it has doomed Yugoslavia from the start. Also in Serbia, there was a spring. They had 71 the Croatian spring, 81 the Kosovo spring, 91 there was the Serbian spring. Also in Serbia, a lot of people was against this Yugoslavian system, against this kind of totally corrupt, brutal system. And they were protesting all the time. In the 90s, there was an active anti-war movement in Serbia all the time. There was student protest. I was myself in 92 as a student leader, in 96 or 97 in Belgrade to support the students there. And it was all the time protest, basically. Also a lot of good people in Serbia, they understood how they are exploited ultimately with these fake narratives, with the socialist economics, with this nationalist agenda. And they understood it very well, but the system, the retiring this empire in retreat, which then has basically taken all the national institutions in Belgrade and were basically occupying their own country. They were basically too strong to overcome without outside help. Then economically also very important for everybody who is interested, the idea of how it really broke the whole system was then in the year 90, when there was already so much different geostrategic situation. And the idea was, some people said, we can still keep it together, it might be a loose federation, but in reality the will of especially the Serbian Republic was no longer there. They wanted to continue to print money, they wanted the other republics to pay, and they took this famous 1.5 billion, I call it theft, but that's what it was. When you live in a monetary union, you cannot just make loans from the central bank. Everybody has to pay back. You steal the money from the joint institutions to pay your own salaries. Markovic was very unhappy. Obviously, everybody was very unhappy. And the other republics decided that this is the level of fairness we will leave. Money very much matters in political entities. And it is a complete theft in a currency union to do that. And basically, I have made this line, I think it's very logically. And then on the 7th of October 91, and then the own army of Yugoslavia, now then headed by a Serbian defense minister, they tried to kill their own prime minister when he was in Zagreb in this famous decapitation strike. Always, this is seen in the context of the breakup of Yugoslavia, and might be true, but, see it also that he was the man who was basically, who they have stolen $1.5 billion from, because he was the Federation Prime Minister. And, for me, it's very much, when the political process, if it's going, he was asking them, where is this 1.5 billion? And they were sending him some MiG fighters and tried to kill him. They didn't manage, by the way, to kill him. He has resigned later when they wanted him to adopt a budget, which was basically funding the war against Bosnia and Croatia. And he then resigned and left to Vienna. So, In this presentation about economics reasons for the breakup, and also a little bit to understand why the culture is as it is today in Serbia and in parts of Bosnia. It's very much to understand that the embargo breaking culture of 91 to 96, it was over 5 years where basically then there was war and embargo. So this toxic mix of collusive, corrupt Yugoslavian culture, mainly defense industry, living off debt in a very chaotic environment of inflation and devaluation, led to, then you create a cluster at the center where the people, only when they have state contracts of the state budget, that's basically defense, or when they have control the export industries, yeah, which there were a few, but also often connected to defense machinery and weapons, basically. And then you create, then for the consumer goods, there was the embargo. Then you have the smuggling routes over Macedonia and Albania from Thessaloniki and from Durrës. And basically you create a very toxic subculture of businessmen, basically living of smuggling beyond the law, and work in the name of the nation and do whatever they want to protect themselves. And this kind of toxic system, and this is really very problematic, and to disentangle and to get to normal levels of competition control and rule of law, contracts. Yeah, after such a decade in smuggling and in this kind of collusive atmosphere, it's really very, very difficult to bring normality in business standards in Serbia again. And this is some of the problems we still face today. Yes, when it comes to infrastructure, it's very important to debunk that myth of Yugoslavia. Everybody who lived some time there or who traveled, you see that also when you see the budgetary consequences of how much is missing. There is a myth that there was some investment, but in Kosovo, Montenegro, and in Macedonia especially, but also in the whole of the south of Serbia, the infrastructure which was available before 1990 was really minimal, and it's really complete lack of investment in water infrastructure, in electricity infrastructure. The whole myth that every house had some electricity. Yes, but we are talking about the 20th century already. That was kind of expected. When you deduct what was inherited from the Austrian-Hungarian monarchy in terms of old rail and road infrastructure, and then you see what was then in 1990 still there, and what was added in the 17 years of Yugoslavia, really that's a very miserable result. There was a little bit better in the north from Zagreb, Sarajevo, and Belgrade, but in the south it's a complete disaster. But even then, most of the things still had after the year 2000 needed to be rebuilt. So what kind of myth of Yugoslavia was working, delivering public service for the people? I mean, this is all mythification of some people with nostalgia, but it's simply beyond any facts. Then let's come to the point of the UTPA, the State Secret Service. It's less famous like the KGB or the Stasi, but the UTPA was very brutal. And it was a criminal entity working for a criminal state. Yeah, we cannot say that. Yeah, it was a bit softer. Maybe it was a bit softer, but for the victims of the UTPA inside Yugoslavia and in Western Germany and in France and in Austria, how soft can you call it when you are killed? Yeah, and they killed many people. They killed it with hired thugs who were basically. There's this beautiful videos on YouTube about the recent investigations, because in the Cold War, the Western Europeans were very reluctant to prosecute this external justice, yeah, of the UTPA in a sense. But now in Western Germany, in Germany now united, they have gone through details and for court process and see the videos. Yeah. There's this famous Secret Service operator who has no kind of repentance, but at least he has the honesty to talk very freely in documentaries about the crimes he did. They were hiring criminal gangs to rob and to do executions in Western Europe. This is how Akan actually has. That's how he developed his criminal skills. He was a hired secret servant agent for contract killings in Germany and Western Europe, and a bank robber. And then he became this very terrible wartime figure and warlord, if you want to call him like that. Yeah, but he started as an UNRWA agent. So when it comes to the Yugoslavian crony oligarch system, there is just recently this big weapons scandal, arms scandal of exporting arms to Yemen and to other Arab states. And basically that's the typical result. But this is the result from Yugoslavia. It didn't start with Milosevic. Yeah? It's this inherited defense industry in a collusive, corrupt, high inflation and devaluation culture where everything goes, where you don't have to keep international laws, yeah, where you can do everything because you are important, yeah, and you are special, and then it creates exactly this business climate which we face today, which is so problematic, and then it creates exactly this kind of oligarch corruption state capture system we have at the moment, and it's all a logical result of this failed economics and this culture of collusion and corruption. I want to say the thing is about the myths of a good dictatorship, which is basically this concept, and also the myths of a good old times. I mean, it's quite understandable in a generational perspective that the people who were indoctrinated in their 10s and 20s in their youth, later when they are 60, 70, have some kind of positive looking back on their past, there was some stability. But let's not forget, that's a typical myth we also have in Germany and Austria. And when you look at the facts, it's actually just a personal retrospective to their own lost youth, which they were deprived of by a terror regime. But they have somehow rationalized it as being good, yeah, because they were the regime loyalists. And each dictatorship works by theft, by selective theft. You take it from one group, like the Jews or the Croatians or the Albanians, and you give it to your loyalists. Yeah, like you give them the jobs the others are not allowed to have. You redistribute the land and the fruits of the land to your supporters. Yeah? And then 20 years later, you go to that country, and the children of that supporters or the former regime loyalists are now pensioners, and they say, "Oh, it was quite good." Yeah. The others had to go, the others were prosecuted, but they live now in Germany. But I'm still here, and I had it better then, because I was always saluting when Tito was coming. And so these effects are very much problematic when international observers then say, yeah, people are still positive about Yugoslavia. I mean, I'm sure, but these are the people who were profiting from a dictatorship which was built on theft and on a Ponzi scheme of debt. So what I say now is basically this all has to come to an end. It needs a good currency policy in Yugoslavia, in ex-Yugoslavia, all in the euro. This is really important. None of the currencies are really a serious long-term fundament for prosperity, fulfilling the task which a currency has to do. All of the countries should be in NATO, because only then the internal threat, which they all pose to each other, especially Serbia to all of them, is only possible to manage inside NATO. So it's very important for Serbia to join NATO and for all of them to join the euro. We have already 4 packed ones. I made several presentations about that one. Macedonia, Bosnia is already packed. Montenegro, Kosovo have the euro already. Slovenia is already in the eurozone. Croatia is now joining. So it's basically currency-wise about Serbia. That's the big issue. Serbia to back to the euro and to adopt the euro. And obviously Serbia is not ready for NATO. And that creates the current imbalance. And that is also the blockade in the progress in the Balkans. Because once Serbia is ready, we can make a peace agreement, recognize Kosovo, get Serbia in NATO, and then get everybody into the European Union. But this really needs to be done. And as long as Serbia is not ready for applying to NATO, there can be no peace in the Balkans. And how we have to do it, we have now, I have made these slides now specifically. We need specific country-specific peace agreements between Serbia and Germany, very much built on the Adenauer-de Gaulle peace, the contracts which they did in '63, the German-French reconciliation must be the role model for the German-Serbian reconciliation. And I remind, when you can make peace between France and Germany, you certainly can make peace between everybody on the Balkan, because that was a millennium of war. That was all about Elsass-Lothringen, and remember that one. And it was really very complicated. The First World War, the French-German War before, and also the Second World War, obviously. Then it was possible to get this friendship going. It was possible to visit the battlefields of Verdun. It was really so many unbelievable things. Yeah? Nobody who had lived in the 1,000 years before 1963 could have ever thought that this kind of scenes and treaties and friendships are possible. So don't get me started and say it's not possible. Terrible things happened between Serbia and Germany. The Germans attacked in '41. Let's make a meeting, German Chancellor, President of Serbia in Belgrade on the 6th of April, say sorry and invite Serbia to NATO and to the EU. Then when it comes to Serbia and Slovenia, terrible things have happened between them in the 10 days wars. That was really also a very terrible confrontation inside the Yugoslavia at that time. Then Slovenian independence came, and so it's time for peace between the former antagonists. The same is between Romania and Serbia. They had a terrible war about the Banat in the year 1990. It was very, very difficult at that time. Now it's time for Romania to recognize Kosovo and for then both countries to adopt the euro, Romania to join the Eurozone, Serbia to adopt it unilateral, and also Serbia to join NATO. And then Austria, of course, and Serbia to make peace. I propose to make a bilateral friendship day on the 28th of July. This is when we have started the war, Austria and Hungarian monarchy, whatever. Austria is not the successor republic, I know that. But 28th of July, to the Austrian Chancellor to go to Belgrade and to apologize and to sign a peace treaty like the Germans and the French, and make sure that Austria applies to NATO, Serbia applies to NATO, and then also Serbia adopts the euro. Also for Serbian and Kosovo reconciliation in NATO and the euro. Kosovo has the euro already, Serbia to adopt, and both to make a peace agreement and both states to sign the membership towards NATO, so both can live in safety. They don't have to love each other. The Greeks and the Turks hate each other and are both in NATO, and NATO could avoid war for now since '52, and the same will be true between Serbia and Kosovo. Serbia and Croatia, obviously that's two big antagonists. Now the cooperation is there. Friendship needs to be established by time. It worked between the Germans and the French, and it will work between the Croatians and the Serbs in the euro, in NATO. And of course, I propose on the 22nd of April, on the Jasenovac Day, let's go there, both leaders of both nations in Jasenovac, shake hands, make up again, confess the past crimes, and say sorry to each other. And then you can go to Vukovar, and there's many symbolic places for Croatian-Serbian friendship. But it's key to get started and to adopt the euro, to join NATO, obviously Serbia, and both then to have the same currency, and then to join the European Union for Croatia, and that's the road ahead. Serbian-Albanian reconciliation, 25th of October is the date for that. That is, sorry. That's the date when the Serbs left Albania in 1913. They had occupied Albania before. And they have, that's the right moment for the Serb president to come, to say sorry. And then there is certainly a lot of historic issues to make up about the past. But now the unity in the euro, also Albania, same like Kosovo, adopt the euro, Montenegro, and is already there. Serbia should be there, and then Serbia to apply for NATO. Albania is already member. And if these are historic enemies, I understand that very well. they have made up like France and Germany. So the same is possible between the Serbs and the Albanians. Here comes Montenegro and Serbia. Also here, time to make peace. I know this history is complicated. Montenegro was basically occupied by Serbia in 1918. It was not really represented in the kingdom of Slovenes, Croatians, and Bosnians. The Northern Balkans never took Montenegro very seriously, so it was not mentioned. It was seen as just Serbs, yeah, and so it was not deprived of its identity whenever it was already an independent state at the same time when Serbia was an independent state from the Berlin Congress in 1878. But no, it was basically swallowed. Very difficult, but okay, now it's time to make peace, and it's possible to get this done. The same is there for Bosnia and Serbia reconciliation, 6th of April, siege of Sarajevo. Really very terrible events just recently in European history. Now it's time to make peace, and peace is happening by the euro. It's happening by the NATO membership. Serbia has blocked the NATO membership of Bosnia for a long time now, and this has to stop, and Serbia itself to apply to NATO. And then obviously Macedonia is already in NATO, big success, and has a backed currency now to adopt the euro, and then also NATO membership for Serbia, and both to make up. Again, the 15th of June would be the best day for a bilateral meeting to celebrate the Tikves uprising, also for the Serbs to apologize for occupation of Macedonia in that year. Obviously, it's difficult in each of these stories and to find the right date. Come back to a Hungarian-Serbian friendship. That's, of course, very important when it comes to the reconciliation. There was the north of Serbia, Vojvodina, Bačka was annexed even, like the Crimea, in 1941 by the Hungarians, 14th of December. That's the right day to say for peace and to repeat the miracle of peace, which was so often done already. I'm just checking, did I forget the Bulgarians now? I hope not. That's the no, that's the Bosnians. I will check, that's the Montenegrins, I will check if I have somehow forgotten the Bulgarians, yeah, I will find them. I'm sure I made that slide as well before, but you get the idea basically. And then that's the Hungarians, and that's the Americans. Obviously the 5th of October, the European Serbia Day, the day of the fall of Milosevic, that's the right day for Serbia and US to reconcile, to overcome all the complicated past, yeah? Understand the past alliances in the First and Second World War, and then also to understand that the US has liberated the Serbs from Yugoslavian terror and from Milosevic, and then to make up and to end this anti-NATO kind of blah blah and rhetoric which some in Serbia, especially the president, has recently. And for this, it will need for the new president, I'm hoping for Biden, to go to Belgrade to also make up with the Serbs and make reconciliation and invite officially in Belgrade Serbia to NATO, best on the 5th of October in 2021, and then to make sure that also no is no answer, and Serbia really to join NATO, also to seal that peace agreement with Kosovo by adopting the euro in Serbia, and also then fast-tracking NATO membership 2023, or maybe it takes half a year longer, but that both pillars achieved, NATO membership and euro adopted, opens then the way for fast-track membership in the European Union of Serbia. And basically that's the way I propose it to overcome all these past animosities and make sure all the three big institutions, NATO, EU and Euro, work hand in hand, and then all the 7 countries who came from former Yugoslavia, and they are in NATO, EU, and Euro. But always make sure that first NATO and Euro, and then as a reward, and it's a bit more complicated to join fully. So politically as well can only come once the alliance question is clear and once the monetary question is clear, because on that one you can build fast-track prosperity. And that's the way. And let me conclude, Yugo nostalgia is a complete myth. It's not justified. It never really was very good or anyhow good for the people living there. They were running away in the millions from the state whenever they could. And economically, it was built by US debt in order not to let it fall to the Soviets. It was a gigantic blackmail. It was internally totally incohesive, and people really didn't want it. And now it was exploding then later in a mountain of debt, like a gigantic Ponzi scheme held together by violence and exploding in violence. And now these 7 countries can live in peace and prosperity together under European and Western standards. And that's basically the invitation. And that's the future I will at least try to promote in the coming months and years. And of course, I understand it's not easy with some, you have opponents in Serbia of NATO, and this has to be overcome. I always remind that we have to lead by example, we Austrians, and we have to join NATO as well in order to set a good example, like the Western Germans have done it. Germany is a role model for Serbia here. And this is really very important to follow this BRD model if you want, but the Slovenian model if you want. And this is the way also for Serbia to apply to NATO and then to adopt the euro as a price for the peace agreement in order to have a prosperous future for the Serbs, to end this terrible currency history, which together with the Belarusian ruble is the most terrible currency in the history of Europe, I think, certainly of post-war Europe. But it's one of the most unperforming and value-destroying currency in Europe. And once it's gone, it's much better. And then to have the euro for all countries in the Balkans, and then to have a better future for the long term, united together again. I understand some will say, oh, we were so good together, 7 countries, why are we now so complicated? Yes, but this is the region of the reality of a multi-ethnic Eastern and Southeastern Europe. It was always like this since historic times. And this is basically just brutal outside or internal force could keep that together for some years. But it was never very cohesive. It never worked economically, politically. And the current organization in the 7 states has a very long-term and very bright future ahead inside NATO, EU, and the euro. And that's what I propose. And I'm confident it will happen. I'm not sure it will happen as fast as I wanted, but you can be sure this will be the reality in the coming decades. And I say much better for many people who don't have to run away and leave to Western Europe if it happens faster, because that's the basis for faster progress and prosperity for many of the great people living in the 7 countries or in the neighboring countries. And that's my way and proposal for peace in the Balkans. Thanks a lot.